Hi, I'm Charlene Collins Freeman, and welcome to my tutorial on painting songbirds with watercolors. In this tutorial, we will paint a little sparrow, a robin, a blue tit, and a tufted titmouse. I am using Daniel Smith watercolors and Arches 140-pound cold press paper. Let's talk about drawing our birds first. Even though we want to paint them loosely, the drawing has to be somewhat accurate, or else our birds just won't look like birds. We don't want to start our drawings by sketching details, and we don't want to start our watercolors by painting details. Our initial drawing should be light and loose, and just focus on the largest geometric shapes we see. Once we're happy with the proportions we've drawn, we can put in construction lines to help us distinguish the posture and angles of the beak, the eye, the tail, and the feet. This will ensure that we can paint pretty loosely and still have a successful bird painting. Use a light pencil, a 2H or lighter, and keep an eraser handy. Let's start off with our robin. These will be our construction lines, and I start off with a line that shows me the posture of the bird. What I mean by that is at what angle the bird is standing. In this image, that posture is really defined by a line I've drawn from the eye to the leg. After that, I draw an oval shape to encapsulate the proportions of both the body and a circle for the head. It's common to draw the head too big and sticking too far forward, so I pay special attention to that intersection that's created where the circle of the head and the oval of the body overlap each other. Getting the proportions of this oval and this circle accurate and creating the correct overlap will give you a strong foundation for your bird. To make sure you're capturing the right posture, it's helpful to draw a line that touches both the circle and the side of the oval, like I've done here on the left-hand side. By judging the angle of this red line, I can judge the angle of the posture I've drawn in. To place the beak accurately, I give myself another construction line, and I draw it all the way to the eye, so I can see if the eye is above, in the middle, or below this line, depending on a bird's posture. Next, I give myself a construction line to determine the angle of the tail where it meets the body of the bird. And lastly, I give myself construction lines for the legs. Notice that they're usually not parallel, and getting this angle accurate will give your bird a good stance. Once these construction lines are put down, it's easy to draw the outline of the bird, and that can even be done quite loosely. I only give real detailed attention to the beak, the eye, and the legs. When it comes to those details, pay attention to how long the beak is, how big the eye is, and downplay any features you don't really want to emphasize. I have the same approach when it comes to painting. As long as the beak and the eyes, the feet and the tail are done accurately, I can be pretty loose with what is going on inside the structure of the body. Here's my drawing for our robin. I will lighten up the lines considerably before I apply paint. Now it's your turn to draw him. Let's go through the same steps for the tufted titmouse. There's my angle of posture. Here's the oval shape that encapsulates his body and the circle for his head. And I pay attention to that overlap area, the angle of the head to the body, the beak, the tail, and the feet. With these construction lines in place, I can draw in the silhouette of the bird and the few details I need to get started for painting. Here's the same process for the little sparrow. I start off with the angle of the body, the oval shape of the body, the circle of the head, paying attention to that overlap, double checking the angles of how the head sits on the body, the beak line, the tail line, and lastly, the feet. With that in place, I can do a contour, draw in details, erase the construction lines, and get ready for painting. I love this image of three blue tits. I chose to paint the one on the far left, but I've done the drawing process for all three. Here you see all three different posture lines and the ovals for the body, how different they are based on different positions. How the head is in proportion to the body and its position. Lines for beak to eye. Construction lines for tail. And construction lines for feet. Here is my blue tit drawing of the bird on the far left. I've placed all four of my birds on a single sheet of 9 by 12 Arches paper, and I have them taped off so that I can then cut them out as four separate little postcard size paintings. Before I start painting, I roll a kneaded eraser across each one of my drawings to lighten up the graphite considerably. In my metal palette, I have squoze out a lot of different Daniel Smith colors. And before committing to any one, I paint a few watery puddles in my mixing area to see which ones I might like best. I encourage you to play around with your colors and don't get hung up on knowing which colors I'm using at every turn. Get to know your colors. You don't need to buy all the same paints I have. You just need to learn how to mix paints to get the colors you want. I'm going to start off with the robin, and I want to start with the lightest areas I see in him, in mostly the body chest area. I water it down first with a lot of water on my brush. You can see how shiny it is on the paper. And I'll drop in a gray mixture I made with transparent pyrrole orange and phthalo blue. Any orange and blue together will create a gray. And if you want it to have a cooler tone to it, just add slightly more blue. If you want it to have a warmer tone, add slightly more orange. I start off by painting the darkest area I see, where the chest meets the orange of the throat, and a little bit of a shadow right underneath the wing. From the shine you see on my paper, you can tell how wet my paper is. And this is a great time to drop in color, not worried about how dark it is. I know with all that water on there, it'll dry quite a bit lighter. I also painted in the grayish area that goes between the tail and the wing. While I let those soak into the paper, I decide to paint the darkest part of his eye, leaving a little spot for a highlight. I'm using neutral tint for this area, or an indigo, or if you have a black. But this area wants to be very dark and very precise. The eye is one of the detail areas that will make or break our bird painting. I go in and just touch a little bit more of that neutral tint into the darkest areas of the robin. If you find that as you drop in darker shades into a wet area, they tend to flood into the lighter areas, just rinse your brush out, dry it out with a paper towel, and then soak up some of that paint where you want it to be lighter. Use your brush as a sponge. You'll see me do just that with this bead of orange paint that I'm painting on the tufted titmouse. It has a lovely orange-yellow hue underneath its wing, but as I painted this in, I realized it's too vibrant. So I rinse out my brush, dry it out on my towel, and use it as a sponge to pick up some of that paint. I find that this creates a much softer transition rather than going in with a paper towel directly and trying to soak that up off the paper. Here I'm testing some of these colors out on a scrap piece of arches. And I decide on alizarin crimson with cadmium red light hue as a mix for some of the cranberries. I'll paint two of our birds with backgrounds and two of them just on a white paper background. I'll be hopping around all four of these bird paintings, letting things dry and circling back to them once things have dried. While this area is still damp, I try again to drop in an orangey yellow bead of color. And again, I find it just slightly too strong, so I soften the edge so that it can go from the strong orange into a lighter hue underneath the body. While I let that soak in, I go in and paint the eye. Be sure you don't paint the eye too big. This is a common mistake. Bird eyes tend to be rather small and they don't have the oval shape that human eyes have. Really pay attention to your picture. Often birds will have a ring around their eye, and here I am really just painting the eye and the suggestion of the ring. Sometimes the ring is textured and sometimes it looks smoother, so I try to capture those small details. Once that's in place, I go back with a slightly damp brush, smooth out the orange belly, and add just a slight bit of Hansa yellow medium hue. This whole bird is really light, so I want to be sure I'm not adding too much color in. As I let that area dry, I turn my attention to our next bird, the little sparrow. Again, I start off with the lightest area of his chest. This time I don't add water to that area, but I could have just as easily. I make sure that the mixture I'm going in with is very watery. It's a brown I created using the transparent pyrrole orange and the phthalo blue that was already in my palette, but this time I've watered it down considerably. I paint in the general area where I see this color, and then while it is still damp, I add the same mix, just with more pigment added to it this time. It might look a little too dark at this point, but keep in mind just how much watercolors can fade as they dry, especially when they have a lot of water in the mix, like I do here. I capture the dark shadow on the right-hand side and that patch of dark right on his chest. There is ever so slightly a blue cast in some of the areas of his white feathers. And even if it weren't there, I would probably add it anyway. I just love the way blue looks when it is shading a white area. I use manganese blue hue for this, and I use manganese blue hue to also paint white highlights on dark areas. For the branch that our little sparrow is sitting on, I make a dark rich brown with the same two colors I used in him, phthalo blue and transparent pyrrole orange. This time there's a lot more pigment in my mix, but it creates color harmony to have the same colors in the bird as I'm using in the branch. That was for the darkest part, the bottom part of the branch. In the middle of the branch, I paint with burnt sienna, and the top part of the branch, I use a bit of buff titanium. I paint these quick enough so that they blend together. I don't want hard edges between my light, middle, and dark hues on this branch. If I wait too long or I'm painting too dry, I'll end up with a branch that looks like it has three stripes instead of three shades of brown. While it's all still damp, I add sap green to some of the areas of the branch to create the impression of moss growing on it. Then I get thick mixture of neutral tint on my brush and paint in the eye. I try to always leave a little highlight for the eye. These shapes for these eyes are really small and it's easy to paint over the whole thing by mistake. If you do that, it's not a problem. You can go in later when it has completely dried with a white color pencil and draw in a little highlight, or you can use a touch of gouache. If you're using gouache, be sure it's nice and thick or it won't really look like a white highlight. For the first layer on our blue tit, I start off with a very watery mix of phthalo blue and just barely a touch of transparent pyrrole orange in it. It's just enough to give this blue a gray cast. And I look at the photo for all the lightest blue shades I see. I water down manganese blue hue and add that to my mix as I paint the feathers on his back and in his tail. We want the blue to be completely dry before we come in and paint any of those yellows because we don't want to turn him into a green bird. I decided to draw him standing on a different type of branch than what he's standing on in the reference photo. And to paint that branch, I add phthalo blue green shade to the mixture of brown I had created earlier. That mixture also used phthalo blue green shade and transparent pyrrole orange. But for this branch, I've added much more blue than I did on the previous branch right above, underneath the sparrow. I darken it up just underneath it while it's still damp, dropping in paint here and there. I love the effects and color mixes that we can get from dropping wet paint into a wet area. Just be sure to not keep stroking. Drop your paint in and then lift your brush out. If you keep stroking back and forth, instead of creating beautiful spontaneous mixes, you'll overbrush the mixture together, end up with a homogeneous, sort of tired looking shape. And I go in and paint the blue tit's eye. I pay attention to the angle of the eye and the shape it makes as his head is tilted down this way. I tend to leave that highlight even if I don't see it in the reference photo. It adds an element of aliveness to any portrait of any animal or person. Since his cheek is absolutely white, the white of the paper, I go ahead and paint the black stripe that runs from his eye to the back of his head. I'm using neutral tint and it's at a pretty thick consistency. I pick up phthalo blue green shade to start adding the band that runs around the back of his head. It's a dark blue, and then as it comes to the front of the body, it turns to a black. So I will adjust from phthalo blue to neutral tint. I'm paying attention to the curve of this, and it follows the circle that I drew earlier to show his head. But I'm also paying attention to how it goes from a thin stripe to thicker, and then as it wraps around the head and comes underneath his chin, it gets thinner again. This helps create that three-dimensional look. Now all four of our birds have a first pass done, and the robin is dry, so I'm ready to come in for a second pass at him. I start with that beautiful yellow shade on his chin, and I'm using Hansa Yellow Medium and Cadmium Orange Hue. I'll also add transparent Pyrrole Orange to the top of the head. But I start off with the lightest area and work my way around his neck to the back of his head. I'm really careful not to paint into the eye area. As I work towards the top of the head, I use transparent Pyrrole Orange and even a touch of alizarin crimson. I paint it in while the yellowy color is still damp so that there's a soft transition between these colors. I work my way around that eye, leaving a white ring between the black eye and my colorful head. I pay attention to where the color ends and the beak begins. Notice that the beak is not on the outside contour of the head, but actually comes into the face a little bit. As I paint onto the robin's back, I add burnt sienna to the mix, and I start to brown up the wings. I add some Aussie red gold to the mix, and I paint in the tail. My brushstroke starts where the tail meets the body of the bird, and then it lifts away as I pull away from the bird, creating thinner lines as my brushstroke moves away down the length of the tail feather. And with very watery mix of the same colors in the tail, I go over that gray spot that connects the tail to the body. As the bird dries, I decide to come in and restate the darker reddish hues on the top. And just a bit around his cheek. It helps give definition to his head, and I love these colors. For his feet, I use a watery mix of the gray I've been using throughout these birds. Mostly phthalo blue green shade with a touch of transparent pyrrole orange. As I paint them in, I follow the drawing and keep checking my reference photo to make sure I have the right angle of each foot. This definitely gives him a fun posture, like he's ready to just hop away. I give another watery coat of Aussie red gold to his chin and lightly brush stroke some of this orangey color into his feathers. I will paint him standing on a patch of grass like he is in the reference photo. But to tie the background into the bird, I want to have some of the same colors in the background that are in the bird. So I use the Aussie red gold and paint that first, and while it's still wet, I add sap green to it. This creates a yellowy green that has color harmony with my robin and suits him beautifully. His chest is totally dry now, and I come in to darken up the areas where there's a little bit more shadow to give him a more three-dimensional look. I'm using the same gray that I've used all along in him. Darkening underneath the wing really helps the wing look like it's sitting on the body. And he does seem to be quite a bit darker right where the gray patch of his chest meets the yellowy patch of his chin. Some of this dark gray is flowing into his belly where I want it to be lighter. So I use my brush as a sponge, cleaning it out on my towel and lifting color out. I add a little bit more color to the wings. Keep my eye on that darker gray I put into his chest, and as it continues to grow into the lighter areas, I squeeze out any moisture from my brush and use it as a sponge to pick some of that dark gray out. Now, with mostly only water on my brush, I take some of the green I painted underneath his feet and pull it up around him. I'm careful around the edges where the bird's feathers are, but I don't really mind a little bit of bleed. It helps add to that loose characteristic that we're painting. Loose watercolors tend to not have really defined edges, so a little bleed is okay. If you find that your colors are bleeding too much, you can just use your paper towel to stop it in its tracks. As I reach the top of the picture, I add a little bit of blue to the sky, very watery, and let it blend with the green. There's no real horizon line, it's all softly blended. It's time to let that dry and turn my attention back to the tufted titmouse. He really is a subtle gray, and within his body he has light, middle, and dark grays. I start off with painting with just water. I paint around his head and his back, bringing that water up to the wing and down through his tail. I start off with a very watery mix of phthalo blue green shade, mixed in the same area where I earlier mixed my browns, and I add even more transparent pyrrole orange to this mix. It's a nice dark, rich mixture, but I'm sure to add lots of water. I always start off in the area where it's darkest in case I miscalculated and the paint is actually darker than I thought. Then I can just add water to lighten it up as I paint into the lighter areas. The tail and the head are much lighter than this area where I started, the shoulder and the wing. So I work my way into those areas with nothing more than a damp brush. This helps the paint I've already put down travel up into those areas. The front of the head is quite a bit darker, so I pick up a bit more paint with my brush. Again, I'm careful to paint around the eye, leaving a white circle ring between the eye and the rest of the bird. I paint in the grayish shadow on the bottom of the belly of the bird. While I let that shadow soak into the paper, I paint a few more brush strokes along the tail. Then I rinse out my brush, I tap out the excess water, and I soften the whole underbelly into that dark shadow so that I get a soft transition. Where it got slightly too dark too quickly, I use my brush and lifted out paint. I use the same mixture of gray for his feet. And I love the stance of his feet, paying careful attention to the footsteps he's actually taking. Again, I lift out a little bit of color where it's getting too dark in his belly. Because that area is damp, you can see how the paint continues to fill that space. But that's okay. As long as it's damp, I can keep coming in and lifting out. For the stubborn areas, I just apply my towel to that area and really lift it out, drying it as I go along. That keeps the paint from continuing to travel there. To really lift out these areas, I'm using an angled fabric paint. Its bristles are slightly stiffer than a watercolor brush, and they're really a great choice for lifting paint. Now I go back to my regular painting brush, the Black Gold 311, and with sap green, I paint in just the suggestion of a few branches of pine needles. I'll be softening these up considerably, so I'm not too concerned about how they lay down. I like painting these with just the suggestion of what they are here and there. So I paint with a milky consistency, and before it has a chance to dry, I will come in with just a slightly damp brush and soften most of these gestures. I also soften some of the edges around the berries. Remember that our eye is attracted to hard edges, and if I make all of these berries hard edge, that's where our eye will go, and I really want the viewer to look at the bird more than the background. So one trick is to soften most of your hard edges. I don't want to soften them so much that you can't tell what's going on, but my paint brush works around these areas quite quickly, softening some edges and skipping around others so that we have a nice mixture of hard and soft edges. As I work up from the pine needles and berries up into the sky, I just have paint on my brush, and I let the green travel up as far as it'll go. Then I pick up a little bit of super watered down phthalo blue and paint in a sky like I did with the robin. Since these watercolors are really meant to be soft, quick little studies, I don't want to spend much time detailing backgrounds. Time to let this painting dry and move on to the sparrow. I start off with burnt sienna at a fairly thick consistency, at least whole milk, and I start painting around his head. It's darkest closer to his eye, and it gets lighter the closer it gets to the top of his head. So I start with those darkest areas first, and then work up with just a little bit less paint towards the top of the head. I pay careful attention to the shape of this brown cap. Once I have the shape correct, I can really go a little bit crazy with whatever colors I want to put within that shape. Here I'm using just the tip of my brush to recreate the brown markings I see on the wings. I pick up more of the gray mixture I've been using all along. I add just a touch of neutral tint to it and water it down to create that dark gray we see on the underside of the tail. He has a dark spot on his cheek, but I don't want to go in too dark too soon. So I water down my mix and paint it in the markings I see. I can always come in and darken later as this continues to fade. I add a little bit more neutral tint to it and start to darken it. And to really capture the sense of his head turning around, I want to be careful with the shape of the black spot on the back side of his head. The markings wrap around his eye, and I want to be careful with that, leaving that white ring of paper. I'll come in later and color in those rings the way I see them in my reference photos. Now that I have that black marking underneath his beak in, I can see just how much darker that cheek needed to get. And I can see that his shadows on the white part of his chest can also get darker. I water down more neutral tint and paint in those soft shadows that wrap around his body. I add a little bit more of that manganese blue that I like to add. The manganese blue I added earlier has all but faded. And then before these spots have a chance to dry, I come in with a damp brush and soften them. I also soften some of the dark marking on his cheek. This starts to give our bird a nice three-dimensional look. With just the tip of my damp brush, I soften the top of that brown spot I painted earlier. That shape mimics the shape of his head nicely, and I really start to see the bird and the posture he's in. I paint around the beak for now. His feet have an orangey hue to them, and I really want to downplay them. So I just mix some of that gray into the transparent pyrrole orange and give myself ever so slightly the suggestion of the foot that I can see in the photo. With a damp brush, I lift out a little bit of that shadow that is starting to trickle into the lighter areas. So our sparrow now also has his medium hues and some of his detailing. Time to move on to the blue tit. He's completely dry now, and I can go ahead and put in the yellow. I use Hansa Yellow medium hue and come in with a strong bolt of yellow. I paint in yellow even on the wing, knowing that I will scuff it up later to look more like the wing that we see in the reference photo, with more of a bluish casty shadow on it. But for now, I want to get that yellow undertone in. I also need to tie in that dark gray shadow into his yellow belly. So I come in with just a little bit of damp brush and drag the yellow I've already painted down into the gray part. Once that's tied in a little bit more neatly, I also add a touch of yellow to the top shoulder. This is starting to stitch together all the different shapes we've painted in. I noticed that there is a ring of yellow right underneath his ring of black, and so just with more of the same paint, neat, Hansa Yellow Medium, I paint in another layer of ring. While I wait for that to dry, I come in with neutral tint and paint in the darkest markings I see on the tail. I continue to build up the darker markings I see on this bird. I've been patiently waiting to paint that dark shock of blue on the top of his head. So now is the time. I get some manganese blue hue and a touch of cobalt teal and mix them together, fairly thick, and I start to paint in the darker blues I see. This darker hue is also on his wing and a little in his tail. And I'm exaggerating the color a bit for the sake of art. I love the contrast between this blue and the yellow. I let the spot of blue that I painted on his head settle into the paper a while. In the meantime, I can go around and finesse some of the other areas of the bird. I soften where the blue meets the white front of his head, right where the beak is. And I just use a damp tip of my brush for that. Towards the back of this blue spot, it's much richer, and so I add a thick phthalo blue green shade. I'm adding it while my manganese blue and cobalt teal are still damp, so they blend together softly. I add some of the phthalo blue green shade to parts of the wing as well. With my angled fabric brush, even though this is totally dry, I can come in and soften. I make sure that my brush is slightly damp, and I stroke back and forth between the gray shadow and the lemony yellow part of the chest. We're coming in for our third and final pass on the birds. It's time to go for the darkest darks and for the details. I start by painting the top of the beak of the robin with a light, watery manganese blue hue. Here, instead of being a shadowy color, it becomes the highlight color of the black beak. I need to let that dry before I can paint the bottom part of the beak, which is truly black. With the beak, just like with the eye, I try to go quite slowly and pay attention to the length and the width. The more you brushstroke it, the easier it is for it to become misshapen. So try to use a smaller brush for these details. The beak, the eyes, the feet, they're all pretty small, spindly shapes, and it's easier to be accurate with a smaller brush. To paint in his feet, I am using that same gray we've used all along, and as I look at the picture, determining which one is in shadow and needs to be darker, which one might be lighter, and does the lighter one have a more pink hue or a more blue hue? It changes from bird to bird, but also depending on the lighting in your reference photo. Now I come in and I start dotting that white circle I left that goes between the eye and the rest of the bird. That ring around the eye is very telling and expressive. So don't paint the whole area just black. You'll find that paying attention to this small detail can add a lot of life to your bird portraits. I use a thicker orange to paint in a few brush strokes around the eye, showing the direction of the feathers. And then with a watery mix, I do a coat of yellow over the tail. The more watery your paint, the less detailed it will be. It will soften details. So for areas that you want high definition, be sure to use thicker paint. I thickened up that paint just a bit to create some brush strokes in the feathers. I restate some of that Aussie red gold. It's a beautiful color and perfect for that area just below the bird's cheek. There's a bit of yellow reflected light on his underbelly, so I paint it in and then soften the edge so that it transitions smoothly into the lighter areas of his body. I switch out to my smaller brush again, pick up neutral tint, and start painting the dark beak. I start with the center line to be sure that it's going in the right direction. And then I paint the lower beak. I'd rather make many small brushstrokes than one brushstroke that is too large when it comes to the beak. I also notice he has a bit of a dark nostril that shows up on the top beak, so I paint that in. Once I'm confident with the shape I've painted in, I drop in just a little bit more neutral tint to darken it up further. I don't like the shape of that dark neutral tint of the beak where it enters the head, so I pick it up with my towel instead of a brush. By pressing hard with my towel, it makes a nice clean pickup with no soft diffusion. And then I go back in and finish up with the beak. I also darken with a very watery mix of neutral tint around the eye. This darkening happens sort of outside beyond the circle of the eye. So in the center, I have my darkest eye with a highlight. Then I have a little circle around it, which is slightly lighter than that dark eye. And then I paint a neutral tint, very watery, around that. That has the effect of setting the eye into the head instead of looking like it's sitting on top of the head. With that neutral tint still on my small brush, I paint in a slight shadow underneath the wing and a few brush strokes where the tail connects to the body. I would like him to look slightly more three-dimensional, and I notice that the shading I put in on his breast has already evaporated. So again, with a watery neutral tint, I come in and reinstate that shadow where his chest meets that golden color underneath his chin. And with small brush strokes, I create some texture and shading along his breast and tummy. As I look him over for a last final pass, I decide that he needs a slightly darker beak. So I pick up a thicker mix of neutral tint and restate the bottom of his beak. With that, I'm done with my robin. I'm ready to move on with my tufted titmouse. Again, I start with watery manganese blue hue and paint in carefully the shape of the top beak. I mix some neutral tint with more manganese blue at still a somewhat watery consistency, but darker than the top of my beak. And I start painting in that dark patch where his head meets the top of his beak. I use my small brush and I make many small little brush strokes to create the feather direction. Then with just a watery brush, I pull that paint up towards the top of his head and I paint that slight shadowing we see underneath his cheek. I really have no paint on my brush, just water, and even that, not a lot of it. After I dip my brush in the water, I tap it on my towel to be sure I soak out the excess water. Then I paint with water, essentially allowing the gray I've already painted into my bird to travel where the water goes. I pick up more neutral tint with manganese blue hue in it, and I restate the shadow I see on the edge of the wing. I'm studying my reference photo looking for the darkest markings to help give this slightly colored bird three-dimensionality. He's a real exercise in discipline and trying to be very subtle and watery with our washes. I use the same gray to paint in his feet. With watery neutral tint, I add some dots around that circle that surrounds his eye, drawing more attention to it. Then I pick up thick neutral tint and paint in the bottom beak. I add more dark markings to the feathers where his beak and face meet, and that helps connect the face to the beak. I restate that very dark shadow that runs along his wing. I watered down some neutral tint considerably and paint in some of the feather markings and shadow that are at the very edge of the bottom of his wing where it crosses against his belly. The paint is very watery and I'm able to add in very subtle shadows with that neutral tint. While that paint dries, I come in to finish off the background. I repaint some of the berries that, when I softened up, got completely dissolved. Again, I try to color that little bit of Aussie red gold underneath his wing and soften it. I love the way it picks up on the redness in the berries. Now I need to let it dry. So let's turn our attention to the sparrow and finish that. Again, with a very watery manganese blue hue, I paint the top part of the beak. I pick up fairly thick neutral tint and brushstroke in the small markings I see on his wings. Those black dots right next to the white of the paper really make those wings stand out. I also re-emphasize some of the darker shapes I see and the underside of the tail. Once we get those darkest marks in, it's easy to see how some of our shadows are just too faint. So I water down neutral tint, quite watery, and paint in just a little bit more of the shadowing I see on his white chest and belly. I also want to re-emphasize the darkness in the branch he's standing on. And with thick phthalo blue green shade, I do another stripe at the very bottom of the branch. This is at a milk consistency, so I have time to come back in with the stripe of burnt sienna above it and have them blend smoothly together. And for the top of the branch, I use a very watery yellow ochre. This helps blend the branch's three different values together. It was a little bit dark, so again I used my brush as a sponge. Having rinsed it out and dried it off, I run it along that yellow ochre and pick it up. You can see how that branch now looks more three-dimensional. I come in with that neutral tint and again do a few dots on the ring around the sparrow's eye. And then it's time to do the bottom beak. I really take my time with these beaks. Even though they are small, it's important to get the angle right. Make sure they don't get too misshapen or too big. Again, like I did in the previous two birds at this pass, I will get watery neutral tint and start poking in some of the little shaded details that I see. As I study the picture, I realize the shadow of where his body is resting on the branch is really quite dark, quite a bit darker than I first saw. And also a little bit of shadow where his foot touches the branch. I come in with that watery neutral tint and start shading that in, blending it into the body. To add a watery touch of blue on the sparrow yet again, I switch to my bigger brush. And with watered down manganese blue hue, I touch in right underneath the wing on the left-hand side and along the whole right-hand side of his chest. And with that, our sparrow is complete. Back to our blue tit. I pick up yet again Hansa Yellow Medium Hue and restate some of the yellow. Although this little fellow's beak appears white, it's not as white as the cheek on his face. So I paint it in with the palest of yellow. Then I pick up a fairly thick mix of neutral tint and give him a few more dark feathers around the band around his eye and beneath his neck. I try to give it the same jagged edge I see in the pictures that really show the feathers. I'm using my smallest brush. And then I darken the bottom of the blue shape that's on the top of his head. My goal is to really capture the shapes of the blue spot and that black ring wrapping around his head. I also paint in more of the black markings I see on the back of his body, where the wing touches up against the tail and just right beneath the wing. This paint is fairly thick, it's dark. I water down burnt sienna and paint in his feet. His feet are really similar in color to the branch he's standing on, and I like the way they blend together. I don't particularly like painting birds' feet or having them stand out much, so this arrangement works quite nicely. I want to be sure I keep his bird legs very thin and not overemphasize those feet wrapped around the branch. I pick up more manganese blue hue and a touch of phthalo blue green shade to really pull off the vibrant blue in his head. I notice that it's darker in the back and lighter in the front, so I don't paint it the same across that whole shape. I also touch back into the bluer areas I see in his tail and wing. And while the feet are still wet, I touch a little bit of blue into them as well, connecting them even more visually to the branch. I soften the top of the foot that's closest to us so that it looks more like it is coming out of those feathers with that soft edge between the bird foot and the feathers. A little bit more blue in the back of his head, and we're done with our blue tit. To finish up our tufted titmouse, I decide to give it a starker background, a very light pass of watery sap green. All the gray in the bird was starting to fade into the gray of the background. And although I don't want to make the background really dark, I want the bird to be separate from it. I paint quickly and I don't get any hard edges this way. I'm using a bigger brush, a watery mix, and painting fast strokes. As always in these final stages, it's time to get in the darkest darks. I pick up more thick neutral tint and paint in the bottom of the beak, the eye, and that dark shadow underneath his wing. I'm looking for any dark markings that I can paint in at this point, including those feathers at the front of his face. Get that center line of the beak in. And I stopped the spreading of that neutral tint into that background that was still wet by pressing in my towel. I decided to give this background a bit more time to dry, and I look up at the robin and notice just how much his darkest darks have faded. So with neutral tint, I go back in and re-emphasize those areas that need to be darker. Essentially, I feel like I'm just retracing my steps of what I darkened earlier. And that will happen when we're painting with such wet mixes. After adding a few more dark markings, I will get my big brush out and soften. And with that, our nice plump robin is done. Another minute of attention on our tufted titmouse and he too will be done. Watery mix of manganese blue hue and phthalo blue, I add just a slight blue tint to the bottom of his wing. I add the same blue to the bottom of his belly as a shadow. With a barely damp brush, I soften up some of the berries and pine needles, and I think he is done as well. Thank you for joining me for my tutorial on painting songbirds with watercolors. I hope you enjoyed it and have fun painting your own birds. Thank you.